Welcome to the Financial Purpose Podcast. All opinions expressed by me or guests of the podcast are solely our own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Life Moves Wealth Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for any investment or financial decisions. Clients of Life Moves Wealth Management may maintain positions in securities discussed in this podcast. All right, and welcome to episode 17 of the Financial Purpose Podcast. I have a great guest today, Jamie Bourne. Say hi, Jamie.
Hi, Jamie.
Good, she's paying attention. Jamie owns a counseling service here in the local Phoenix area. And I've known Jamie for a couple of years, and we were having a conversation over the past couple of weeks, and I thought it would be interesting to have that conversation as a podcast episode rather than just an email thread. And Jamie, let me read a little bit about you, and then you can introduce yourself in case I don't get everything correct. So, Jamie earned a master's degree in social work from the University of Missouri. I think that's where I'm supposed to say go Tigers.
Go Tigers, yes.
Okay. And is independently licensed as a clinical social worker in Arizona, Missouri, Florida, and Texas. She holds additional, that's a word. She holds additional credentials as a board-approved clinical supervisor, certified life coach, certified clinical trauma professional, and is an eye movement desensitization and reprocessing practitioner. I don't know what that is, so we're going to come back to that. I'm going to write that down because that's interesting.
EMDR for short.
Yes. All right. So you have served as a consultant and speaker and feel strongly about supporting individuals and continuing their growth journey across the lifespan. And you've done some other really cool stuff with the Entrepreneurs Organization, Young Presidents Organization. And you live in North Phoenix with your wonderful husband and 3 children, which are fun to follow. And so, Jamie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. No, I think you kind of covered everything. Pretty much it.
Good, because that's right on your website. So glad it's all there.
It's all up to date and accurate. So
perfect.
Yeah.
So the conversation, Jamie, that we've been having is I because of your work as a counselor and my work as an advisor, and we've talked about this before, sometimes my work crosses kind of into a little bit of counseling, right? Just because I'm dealing with people who are making financial decisions. And my philosophy is if I don't understand the mind that's making the decision, it's almost malpractice to ask somebody to do something without understanding the motivations or the factors that they may be processing to make that decision, right? And whether or not they're in a good place to do so. And so I had asked you about this thing that I had kind of thought of as nothing better than just drift. It feels like there's just this drift that a lot of people are going through. And so I guess we can start by saying that I think that, and you had mentioned this in your notes, that there's definitely a marker where the pandemic changed fundamentally some things. So prior to the pandemic, what were people coming to you for as a counselor? What were they dealing with? And how have you seen that change over the past 2.5, 3 years?
Sure. So prior to the pandemic, I think, people were not seeking mental health services until things felt like they were at a crisis point. And I think that has shifted a little bit over the last, 3 years. However, I think you could also make an argument that was a, global crisis that at its core shifted, I think, in a really positive way, how people are utilizing and viewing the mental health system. Historically, it's been really reactive. My hope is that we can continue to move to a space of being more proactive, right? One of the things that you had said in my bio was around working with people over the continuum of their life, right? And how do we start to utilize therapy in a proactive way rather than a reactive way, so that people have, so people can avoid drifts, to be quite frank. I think a lot of times people get into drifts because we just operate subconsciously so much of the time, unless we're really intentional about getting out of that space. And so prior to the pandemic, I think a lot of people were coming for, mild anxiety, depression. A lot of the work that I have always focused on is trauma and substance abuse. And I have worked with kids of all ages, so young kids, teens, adults, couples, families. And so both of those issues have always been really relevant, and then really ramped up and became more normalized, I think, in the last 3 years. I think that people are redefining their definition of trauma, and redefining the acceptability around seeking services. And as a result, the mental health system is pretty taxed. I get a lot of feedback from folks around trying to find services, and they're, calling people and nobody's even returning their call, having trouble finding affordable services, all of those sorts of things. And so one of the things that I've been working really hard at is making sure that people can get connected to resources, whatever that may be. So I don't know that the content has changed as much as we might think that it has in terms of what we're working on therapeutically. But when people are seeking services and kind of they're getting services earlier than perhaps they would in the past.
Okay. And in your, in the notes that we had exchanged, you talked about big T trauma and little T trauma. So can you explain what the difference between those two things are?
Yeah, so it fascinates me, right? When somebody is coming in, I used to ask the question, so tell me about anything traumatic that you've experienced in your life. And 99% of the time, people will answer, none. I didn't have anything traumatic in my life. And when you start really getting into people's histories, it is quite literally riddled with trauma. But people don't necessarily define some of those things as trauma in the way that as a certified clinical trauma professional that I do, right? So big T traumas are those big traumas that anybody would identify as being traumatic. So, being engaged in an active war, a very horrific car accident, a rape, right? These kinds of things that anybody that would look at that from the outside would be like, oh yeah, that's trauma. Whereas you have little T traumas, which are those more insidious kind of day-to-day life stressors, that actually over time can cause the same, if not worse, trauma symptom presentations as those big T traumas do. And those are the things that we don't readily identify as being traumatic, but they are.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And so hearing you say that, the first thought that came to my mind is so the little T traumas can kind of stack up or compound on each other to become worse than a big T trauma. Is that is that something where eventually it kind of becomes self-fulfilling because one thing goes wrong? So let's say it's a job loss, right? Something that is insidious. It's not it's a huge inconvenience. It can actually be financially and socially, it can be a very traumatic thing. But let's say that there's a job change, and we'll say it's a change because there's been a replacement. But then like the car breaks down, and then the sister yells at you on the phone, or whatever it is, right? Like all these little things, or you have a fight with a parent that has been a rocky relationship, right? So those things, how do you see those compounding and leading to just like the big, does it eventually become a big T, or how does that work?
It can, and here's the thing: as humans, we all experience both of those things. I don't think any of us get out of life unscathed from either little T traumas or big T traumas, but they do look different for everybody. And what we do know is that trauma, it's particularly early childhood trauma, and into those more formative years, changes the way that our brain develops. It changes the physiology of our nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
we're almost teed up, right, to be experiencing life at an elevated level, whereas somebody who didn't necessarily have all of those stressors has a different brain chemistry. And what that does is it positions people to be making decisions out of a state of fight, flight, or freeze.
Right.
Right. And so when you're in that kind of decision making, your limbic system is not fully online. So you don't have the capacity to look at all of the things that somebody who isn't firing on that level has. And so it certainly can predispose you, right? There are poor health outcomes associated with early childhood trauma. And so it changes the way that we show up to life.
Yeah. And I often on the money side of that equation, because I am not and will never pretend to be a licensed counselor, right? So I know things basically just because there's things that I've experienced or I've seen, right? So I have some anecdotal evidence of different things, but I believe that in childhood trauma, as a part of that, is kind of how you form a money story. You see how your parents were with money or weren't with money sometimes. You hear how they talk about it, right? It shapes a little bit of your values around money. And I think that becomes more than just about money as a utilitarianism tool, right? It becomes how you see the world financially really determines how you see the world in a lot of other places, and that's just one wedge that's kind of slid in there. So how do you, I think what I asked you in our notes is do you agree with that, and maybe how do you see that kind of catapults into other areas?
Well, I think that we all develop money scripts, right? As
Mhm.
you're talking about, and the research actually shows that there are mental health challenges associated with not having enough financial security and also with an overabundance of financial security, and they manifest in different ways, but there are on both ends of the spectrum mental health challenges, right, where you've got insecurity around basic needs being met on the one hand, right, and on the other hand there tends to be a really high pressure to achieve, isolation from one's parents, and relationally, and that causes a separate set of issues, but both are actually really significant, right? And so what I've seen working with couples and families is that when people are aware of their money script, it has much less power over dictating their present day actions and behaviors. When people are unaware of their money script, but any script in general, right? And oftentimes that money script is tied into some other kind of trauma, whether that's, attachment trauma with your parents, right? Whether that's, socially at school, that it isn't just isolated to the financial part of it, but that it extends into these other areas, right?
Yeah.
And when people are unaware of that, that is really when that has the potential to cause problems.
Yeah. And is the awareness, is that a continuum in your experience?
What do you mean?
Meaning, so if somebody is unaware of those scripts that are running and informing their decisions, and then there's a point of awareness in the face of high emotions. So let's say a major disruption in their personal life, their financial life, the stock market, whatever it is, where the emotions, what is that? The amygdala hijack, or am I using the correct terms there, right? So we slip back into the whole, reptilian brain thing, and we're making emotional decisions, and we can't hear the rational decision. So is that more of a continuum, or is that just an emotional hijack in that point?
No, I think that it's more of an emotional continuum, although you can get hijacked at points, right? And being aware of when you are hijacked.
Mhm.
The term that we use a lot around that is being flooded.
Okay.
And you have this awareness around being overly emotionally activated, and flooded. It's not a great time to make decisions. um,
Yeah.
because you're operating from that emotional space. And so oftentimes when I'm working with couples or families, we will talk about separating heart and business conversations. And I always recommend that people have those heart conversations first, because if we can kind of sift through what's coming up for each of us individually emotionally and have an understanding of, here's how I'm showing up to this business meeting that we need to have about the finances, and here's how you're showing up to this business meeting about the finances, all of a sudden we're already connected in a different way, right? If we jump into that too fast and people are already, elevated higher emotionally than they would normally be, then that conversation gets even more hijacked,
Yeah.
and doesn't go anywhere productive. So making sure that you're separating those two.
Yeah, and I of course have seen that play out in my office from time to time. And so I imagine you see it, of course, and it's always interesting to me because I feel like, well, let me back up what I feel. Is money still, as much as we know, is that still kind of the biggest breaker of a marriage?
It's a big piece to it. I think that a lot of times the big issues that people are seeking services around are financial and child rearing,
Mhm.
parenting. And a lot of that has to do with, well, a lot of the work that I do around that is how people are communicating about those issues. So it's not even necessarily that there's a disagreement on how it can go about, it's on how they're communicating about those differences that is problematic and causes things to elevate. Because it's okay. I suppose it's okay that you have different money scripts, right? In fact, that can actually be leveraged to your benefit
For sure.
as a couple, right? But it also has the ability to present as this point of contention. And that 100% boils down to how we're communicating about things and our individual awareness about what our money scripts are and where those and parenting scripts, right? Which is often tied into that financial script,
Yeah.
you know. So yes, and it doesn't mean that they have to be on the same page about that.
Yeah, and I can tell you from my own experience, as I know you're aware, Melissa and I, a blended family, and so we had completely different money scripts, completely different parenting scripts, both coming out of or coming into a second marriage, right? And we actually just had our 13th anniversary yesterday. Right?
Perfect.
Yeah, so we're doing like we got it figured out. But the first couple of years, there were definitely some and I would probably agree that it was more communication, and a lot of that was on my side because I was trying to figure out how to communicate my point, right? Which is part of the trauma going back, is like, okay, I need to make sure that what I think is actually validated and coherent, and I can communicate it well, and not get shot down or whatever. And I think in my experience, that's what I see a lot playing out too, is that one of the individuals in that relationship will say, I feel like you never listen. I feel like you always shoot down my ideas, right? Those kinds of things. And really it's not, it could just be fully a communication gap.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, a lot of times people will even, and here's what I love, because sometimes there are people doing this proactively and they're talking about parenting and finances. And then there's the reality, right? There's the theory of how we're going to do things. And then there's the reality of how we actually implement those, right? And so talking about parenting, and finances before you, join accounts and start having babies, is great. And then you also have to pivot in real time once those things actually happen, because the reality of those two things, I don't think, can ever be fully planned for. And so even when you're doing something like that proactively, we evolve, we change, we grow over time. Our financial situation changes over time, it fluctuates, right? And so having the ability to communicate effectively about what's going on for me and how that's impacting us as a couple, as a
Mhm.
family, those skills are really critical to, I think, being able to make it through those kinds of ups and downs and being able to pivot when you need to.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of brings me back to the drift, that word, right? Um, and it's interesting because what I've kind of I don't think it's a discovery, but what I've just observed is that people, it seems, coming out of the pandemic, our value systems completely changed. I've seen people who were committed to things just completely back out because I think that the pandemic maybe gave them permission to reassess their priorities, and so some things just aren't there anymore. But I've also seen people just be a little bit. It's either that we're slower to take action or make decisions on things, and I don't know if that's a matter of trying to again that whole priority assessment. But I've also heard people on the other end of it say that they can't remember ever being so busy with social events and kid things and all of that. So how do you see this drift kind of playing out? And I know in your notes you were talking about consistency and homeostasis and things like that. So can you touch on that as far as what's the from the expert's opinion? I'm using the word drift. What am I actually talking about?
Well, I think the drift is an appropriate term, and I think that it's easy to kind of demonize that as being, ineffective and slows me down, and it's this thing that's really a pain,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I need to jolt myself out of somehow. And the reality is that that's our brain's way of trying to protect us. And so I think sometimes even just shifting how we're viewing being in a drift can actually help to having a little bit more grace for ourselves as we're going through some of these things, because I think things were kind of trucking along, and anytime we're in a drift, right, it's even if it's maladaptive, so even if we are kind of drifting along life and we're in this pattern of thinking, behaving, responding, that's not actually serving us, to our brain it feels pretty comfortable, right? And so it's really our brain's way of kind of conserving mental energy, and doing what is comfortable. Our brain always wants to do what's comfortable, even if it's not necessarily the best thing for us. And so I think a lot of times getting to a space where it does take some sort of, I don't know if necessarily crisis, but some sort of point of interjection to get us to kind of go, maybe we need to be doing something a little bit differently, that this doesn't actually align with, the goals that I have set for my life. And I think that a big piece to that is, right, so the pandemic kind of shook everything up. And so people are reassessing their core values. They're reassessing what's important to them. They're reassessing everything. And I think that is a complete identity shift. And that takes a lot more time than we think that it should.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think that as the dust settles and people are trying to figure out, what does this actually look like moving forward? It's hard to be able to sit down and find the time to think about those things when you have X, Y, Z, A, B, and C that has to get done. And so what happens, I think, is that people get stuck in doing these urgent but very non-important things on a day-to-day basis. And what happens is then that those important things that we really need to be focusing on, that are, tied to our, purpose and passion and how we derive meaning from life, sort of gets pushed on down the line. And that's how we get into that drift, right? And so I think, to answer another aspect to that question, is that there was a moment in time where people didn't know what was happening. Nobody knew, in the very beginning, what was going on. And then there was a huge range in how people experienced this,
Yeah.
right? People were like, I don't buy this at all. I'm just going to live my life the way I've been living it, and it's just fine. And there were other people who, were on the very opposite end of that spectrum, that were fearful to be in public, fearful to socialize, fearful for their health, fearful for the health of their loved ones, right? And that's just the physical impact. And then you think about, right, the economic impact and how that that hit people in different ways. And so everybody is going to deal with that in a different way. Some people are going, right, it's that fight, flight, or freeze, there's a fourth one, fun, but I do think, right, some people are going to fight, so they're going out and they're like, all right, we got to pivot, we got to figure out how to do this differently, we're going to do all of these things. That's a fight mechanism.
Mhm.
Fleeing, right? I'm just not, I'm going to go, hunker down, and I'm just going to work from home, and I'm going to do my thing, and I'm going to, kind of walk away from all of this, and, kind of insulate myself a little bit. Freezing, right? I'm just not going to do anything. I can't make any decisions. I'm in paralysis. So I have all of these things that I need to do, and I just can't do any of them.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And so I think when people are coming out of that, it does slow our decision making down. And people in general, I think, can still be disoriented, even if they don't think they are. That people are still trying to reorient to what life looks like now and what has shifted internally, right? And so people may not have spent the time or had the awareness that things have shifted for them internally. And so when these things are coming up and all of these decisions need to be made, and now I'm slow on making decisions, and that is unusual for me. Why is that? Perhaps you're still reorienting to some internal shift that you've not yet recognized.
Yeah, and I think what's been really interesting with that, especially in the lens of like an identity shift kind of thing, what I wrote down as you were talking about it is that possibly the drift comes from there being conflict with where you're seeing your life moving versus where you think it should be moving, or maybe you're drifting or unable to make decisions because what you're trying to move toward is in conflict with what you used to move toward.
Mhm.
And so that could be slowing down the decision making thing. But I also wrote down the disorient versus reoriented, and that was of interest to me because what I've seen seems to me, you might have a different lens on this because of what you do every day, but it seems to me that more and more people are talking about a heightened sense of anxiety. And that's preventing them from doing things. And as you said earlier, the mental health profession is taxed with resources to be able to help these people. So, and I know you can't, it would probably be inappropriate to just say, oh, these people it's not anxiety, it's a disorientation. And I think that probably would be a really foul blanket statement, right? But how much of that is like, if I can't make a decision, that's going to make me overtly anxious, and then that's going to play out to other areas of my life. That's all tied to the identity shift. I mean, did the pandemic remap our brains? I mean, what?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I think the long-term effects of that have yet to be determined. But when I think by definition, being disoriented is anxiety provoking. And it's an appropriate response, right? The problem is that people continue to experience that elevated level of anxiety after the appropriateness of that is gone.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it isn't about, right, like shutting off anxiety. You want anxiety. Anxiety is a really great thing when it's firing appropriately, right? It's when that starts to misfire at times that it shouldn't be firing that can become problematic. And so, yes, I think, right, when it's almost the same thing, it's just a different way of describing it. Disorientation, anxiety. I think that's sort of a global thing. And what should happen is that system calms itself down, but that's not necessarily what we're seeing happening yet. And that's actually something over time, right? So we're designed, right, from primitive days. When you walk outside and you see a lion, that's when you want to go into fight, flight, or freeze, right?
Right.
You need that. It's a survival mechanism. And what's happened is that system is activated, but there's no lion. And so when that system is activated and there's not actually a threat right in front of you, cognitively, you're not making decisions in the same way that you would if that wasn't there. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense, because the stress of a situation feeds the emotion, and then again back to the hijack. You're now making a decision from a different. You can't. It's like, for me, wanting to understand the person making the decision. I can't, when somebody, so say with the market volatility over the past year, if I get a call from a client and they're really concerned and really upset about where the investment accounts are and things like that, they're already, by the time that they call me, they're already in a state of emotional overdrive. And any amount of logic that I introduce to that conversation is not going to work.
Correct. Correct. Which is where that's the difference between the heart and the business conversation, right?
Right.
You can call that logic versus emotion, right? Heart being the emotion, logic being the business conversation. When that system is overly flooded, you're not going to be able to have those kind of logic conversations. And right, all of that is based in fear, right?
Mhm.
And so a great
Sure.
question is, what would you be doing if you weren't afraid of the outcome? And oftentimes, because those emotions are usually, especially with market volatility, right? People are calling because they're scared. There's something in their future that feels at risk in that moment, or even something right present day. And so I think a question to kind of shift people out of that is to say, okay, I'm hearing a lot of fear. What would you be doing, thinking, feeling right now if you weren't afraid of the outcome? How would that shift what we're talking about right now? Um, and that seems to get people to stop at least momentarily and go, uh, because even having the awareness of how much fear is actually present can start to take that activation level down.
Yeah. Yeah. I wrote that down. I'm going to steal that. Thank you. Because that's way better than going, did you watch the news this morning? How much CNBC are you watching?
Or calm down.
Right,
It's
right,
okay. Take a
right.
breath, right? Like if it was that easy, people would do it. And it's not that simplistic.
I learned a long time ago that even just at home, right? And certainly with clients, it's like if somebody's already over there, like the calm down thing,
Not helpful.
no, it's actually like
Yes. Yeah.
went from 9 to a 900. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So as all of this stuff, I think because I see the financial impact of everything that we're talking about, and that causes a lot of shifts in how people think about money. And even sometimes, going back to understanding the mind of the person making the decision, there are some decisions that are purely logical. They're in the person's best interest and they're fairly easy to implement, and they just can't get there. And sometimes it's a money script, sometimes it's an emotion thing. And so how do if you're somebody, or if you're talking to somebody who might be listening to this conversation, how do they kind of make the shifts, or what are the considerations maybe that they need to make, or that they can consider making? Because when you say, I think the term like need to make is problematic potentially, right, for somebody. So
Here's
as a
what you should
helpful,
do. Let me tell you what you
yes,
need to
what
do.
you need to do, yes, that doesn't work either, right? That again, 9 to 900. So how does somebody think about this? I know the hardest thing to do, and I'm sure there's a lot of psychology wrapped into this. The hardest thing to do is when you're in the middle of that moment to just go, oh, I'm being irrational. Let me fix that real quick, right? So how does somebody interrupt that process when they're in the middle of it?
Well, you have to be aware of it first, right? And I think a lot of times people are unaware that that's happening in the moment. And so a lot of I think support around, because right, logic and emotion, it's a spectrum. And everybody falls on that spectrum in different places, and neither is good or bad. They both have side effects. Right. And so I think having some basic level of awareness as to where you fall on that spectrum is
Mhm.
really, really important, right? Am I so far over here on logic that it's hard for me to see anybody that's expressing emotion about this because it just doesn't make sense, right? To the very opposite end of the scale, what you're describing, right? Like, how can you just disregard X, Y, and Z and continue? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Help me understand. And sometimes that's actually a good question. So help me understand, right? Why we're continuing to do this when you say that this is the thing that you really want, and yet this behavior and thought process is not actually supportive of that thing that you say that you want.
Mhm.
right? Because oftentimes there's some payout here that people don't recognize. We call those secondary gains, right? And it's one of the things that makes change really, really hard, because we continue, and maybe it is just that drift is comfortable. That might be the secondary gain,
Sure.
right? But there might be something deeper as well. And so I think just having an understanding of where you're at on that spectrum is a good place to start. And then really, really getting clear on, what am I doing? What do I want to do? All of the things that I do on a day-to-day basis, what am I trying to get to? Right. And being able to outline that purpose, passion, you know, what are my core values, right? What am I
Yeah.
striving to do here? And then being able to take a really, really honest look at, is what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis supporting that or not? And most of the time there's a mixed bag, right? Most of the time there's some things that you look at and you're like, oh yeah, I feel good about that. That's moving me here. And yet why am I continuing to do, these things that are sabotaging those forward movements? And then taking a little deeper dive into what those things are and why they continue to exist. So I think that those are good places to start.
Yeah, and we were talking before we started recording about financial purpose, and that's how I kind of use that as a almost like a process interrupter for people who are making emotional decisions. Is that I know that when you were operating from a logical brain, from the business side of your homeostasis, we were able to determine your core values and write out what's most important and what are we working toward. And so I use the example of knowing my financial purpose, and Jamie, if you were my financial advisor and you knew my financial purpose, and if I came to you with a decision like I'm going to buy a Ferrari tomorrow, right? The first question isn't, let's see if you can afford it. The first question is, what's going on?
Help me understand that. Help me understand your motivation for that.
Yeah. Yeah, because it would be really cool to buy a Ferrari, I suppose, if you're into that kind of thing, but it doesn't, my financial purpose, it doesn't help me, build a business, give my wife options, give freely to the community, go on adventures with the family, right? So, I think that's a lot of it. At least that's my untrained way of
Yeah.
interrupting that.
Yeah. And I think there's other, subtle strategies too. Like once you have those, because I think what happens, right, even if you take the time to sit down and outline those values and that purpose, it can get lost in just the day-to-day redundancy of what we have to do, which is in and of itself a drift, right? The redundancy of the day-to-day is a drift. And so it's easy to get caught up in that. And so what can you do to keep those at the forefront of your mind, right? I worked with a family who had in huge steel carved out letters as they were leaving the house to go into the garage, their family values. So there's 5 huge signs as everybody walks out of that house every single morning. And so that's a reminder to all of them on a daily basis. These are the values that we're trying to uphold in our life as this family unit.
Yeah.
And so what are we doing to make sure that stuff doesn't get lost in the day-to-day?
Yeah, I like that. I think it really can work. And you always run the risk of that becoming just wallpaper, right? So, and that's the intentionality behind it. And I wanted to ask you about one thing that you said a couple of minutes ago. You're talking about the continuum of the ultra logic versus the ultra emotional, and why can't you see from the pandemic moving forward? Did that? I think that might have contributed to some of the tribalism that kind of came out of that. What I mean by tribalism is you believed it, you didn't. You got the vaccination, you didn't, right? You voted for this one, you didn't, like that kind of thing.
Polarization, yes.
And it felt like ultra polarization. Like there was no middle ground. You were either for it, or if you weren't for it, 100%. Like if you're unsure, then you're absolutely against it either way.
Right.
So is that part of that continuum? Is that kind of what feeds into that? Or is it something completely different for another conversation?
I think that's actually different. I think that is right, because when when the brain experiences something traumatic, right, we all, as I said, deal with that in different ways. And so I think that some of that is an attempt to find what's comforting and normal and feels good and safe.
Yeah.
And that's different for different people. And so I guess maybe in some ways it does reflect that the opposite ends of the spectrum, because that's what you see, right? Some people felt really, really safe here,
Yeah.
and other people felt really, really safe here. And rather than, just kind of acknowledge and say, great, do what you need to do to feel safe right now, whatever that looks like. There was this demonization, right, of the other end of that spectrum. And the reality is we're all human, dealing with human conditions. And so I think they were actually both responses to trauma that just looked very different. And so when they look very different, people don't understand how you could respond to something in such a way when your own personal response is very different. And then there were a whole bunch of people in the middle of that were like, what? But similar, right? Where they didn't, they had a different trauma response that wasn't quite so polarized. And that still felt, scary.
Yeah. So I think probably on the way to landing the plane here, I had asked you what some steps are that people can take to kind of safeguard their health, because I think we've done a pretty good job in this conversation establishing some of the mental health. I want to be very careful with using the word issues. But some of the mental health considerations, maybe is a better term for this, is that a lot of it comes back from trauma. It impacts the way that we make decisions. There's always a financial component wrapped up in a lot of that. So what can people do kind of as some ways to maybe even safeguard their mental health as they're experiencing or interpreting some of this trauma? And then maybe even more importantly, what can somebody do to get help?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of protective factors that around mental health, right? And I think that one of the things that's really important is to neutralize the language that we're using around challenges with mental health, right? We categorize different emotions as good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that they are neither good or bad. They are simply information, right? And we want those things to be firing again when they should be to the appropriate, duration and frequency and intensity, given the context of the situation, right? And so I think that it's not necessarily emotional distress is not necessarily tied to a distinct emotion, but it is tied to how we talk to ourselves about the emotions that we're experiencing. Right? If we identify this as being problematic, then it is problematic, right? Instead, if we can start to look at some of those emotions that we, tend to label as bad, right? And start asking different questions around that. What is my brain and my body trying to alert me to right now? Is there something going on that needs my attention? Why is this emotion coming up for me right now? Because there's information in that. Right. So if you feel, you walk into a room and you feel, unsteady about something and the hair on the back of your neck prickles up, instead of being like, oh, here's this anxiety thing again, and it's just destroying everything as soon as I walk into this room and I don't even know why. Right. If we can shift out of that space into a space of curiosity around what is going on right now. Is there a real reason that I should be experiencing this or not? And if so, how do I then tend to it? And if not, why is that firing right now?
Mm-hmm.
And start to get to kind of the root at what is activating that in moments that it doesn't need to be activating. That is a big protective factor. Having strong connections with your family and community is a huge protective factor. Connection. It's one of the biggest protective factors in terms of mental health. And sometimes we have a chosen family. That doesn't necessarily, family doesn't have to indicate, right, biological.
Right. Biological. Yeah. Well, and just real quick on the connection thing, that's one of the things that we saw that fundamentally was potentially harmful with the pandemic, is we were told not to physically connect. Right now Zoom and FaceTimes and all those things became really a great way for people to connect, but it's not the same as being in somebody's space, right? There's an energy. Is it a dopamine thing? I mean, with
Well, I mean, it's just having something tangible. I mean, it is different connecting, virtually than it is in person. It's, I don't know, it's disorienting though, right? When we're used to being in close proximity, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because we're physically disconnected that we can't still feel connected emotionally and mentally, but it was a reorientation of the definition of what it means to be connected to our family, right?
yeah,
So I think that's actually a good example of that concept. So I mean, and people have different thresholds of comfort around connecting and physical connection versus this kind of connection. Some people are much more comfortable connecting with people in this way than they are physically and standing next to somebody.
right.
um,
Yeah, the introvert stream.
spectrum, yeah, spectrum there too, right? Love languages, some people are really high on physical touch, some people are not. And so it wasn't a big deal. They were like, okay, cool, no hugs, perfect.
Right.
Whereas for other people, that was really, really devastating. Um, so I don't know if that answered. Did that answer?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, I almost cried when there was the report that the Dr. Fauci had said that it might be a thing where we no longer high five or shake hands. I was like, no, no, those are
Yeah.
important for
You
me.
can't do this. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so going back to what you were talking about, on the thing of connection and increasing, family and community and service and things like that. When is the point where somebody should consider therapy services?
So I think with therapy services, this is sort of a double-edged sword for me because my training will say when it becomes pervasive and it's causing pervasive problems in one's life, meaning it's causing problems in multiple areas of one's life
Mhm.
to the point that it is disrupting life in a negative way. I actually disagree with that. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier around the reactivity of the mental health system. I don't understand why this isn't as normalized as, a physical that you go have every year. And why we're not doing those sorts of things with mental health. Why are we waiting until people are fully grown adults with really, really long-standing maladaptive ways of behaving and making decisions based on traumas that are no longer present? Why are we not starting with kids when they're very young and talking about all of these things and getting into a space where it's more proactive? So I think that a really good time to do therapy is when things are really hard and you're in distress. I think the best time to do therapy is when things are easy
Mhm.
and you feel good because you can dig into some of those. You have more stamina and strength, I think, to do some of the deeper dive into the more insidious, darker, destabilizing spaces than you do when you're in distress. When you're in distress and you come in, what is it? It's triaging, right? We're bandaging symptoms, but we're not looking at the source of the wound. And until we can get to the source of the wound, you're always going to be putting on those band-aids, right? Which is what those points are. And then we're just looking at stabilization. And oftentimes people get stabilized and they're like, great, I feel good. Thanks for your help. And then they go on, right, without ever getting down to that root cause of what was initially causing that. And so it's become this sort of revolving door around bandaging people up and sending them on their way.
Yes. So as a clinician, I would imagine that gets very difficult to actually understand what somebody's true homeostasis is because you're meeting them in crisis,
Yes.
and then you're only seeing them come out of crisis, but you don't know what that bell curve is.
Correct. And then, right, as a clinical supervisor, I have the privilege of supporting incoming clinicians at, defining who they are as clinicians and learning how to do this. And so many of them struggle with this concept. Like, so it seems like everything's kind of going okay. So should I be terminating? Like, this isn't appropriate to give care anymore? And I'm like, are they getting value from this?
Mhm.
Right. So just because people don't have a high, level of symptom presentation doesn't mean that therapy is not valuable for them. And that you can't be doing really, really, really important work. But it is, again, that sort of the training that you get kind of coming in, right, is around that symptomology presentation. So again, I think that the best time is when you're feeling really great, and also when you're not feeling great. So
Mhm. And when you're feeling great, I imagine that that gives the person and the clinician some tools to work with when things kind of go south.
yes.
Okay. Well, Jamie, this has been informative for me. Is there anything else you would add or that I haven't asked about or that you want to ask me that would make sense in the conversation?
I don't think so. I just appreciate the conversation. I feel like one of the things that I appreciate you just as about you as a human is just your attention to this, because I think a lot of times people really try to separate, right? This is finances. You got to take the finances out of, it's business. You can't have the emotions in business, and we can't do this, but that's not how people
No,
work. It's
no.
just not how people work. And I think that there's a disservice being done when people are coming with emotional things and the response is great. How are we gonna, finance that when that's not, as you were saying, the best response?
Yeah.
So I just appreciate the because this goes back to, for me, kind of the holistic nature of this. Like, we have these silos, right? We've got finance silos, we've got medical silos, we've got mental health silos, we've got spiritual silos, we've got all of these silos.
And those all have baby silos within them, right? So,
Yes.
yeah.
And so why aren't we merging them? Because and there's a lot of integrative health and all of those things. And sure, I just don't know how well we're doing all of that yet. But it's nice to see people who are trending that way. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, tell the listeners how they can get in touch with you if they would like to continue the conversation.
Yeah, so I'm happy to continue the conversation. The other commitment that we have made as an organization is to make sure that people are getting connected to resources, whatever that looks like, even if it's not with us. And so if you are one of those individuals that has not had a return call from a therapist, or cannot find one that will accommodate your financial, insurance, time, gender preference, whatever, right? We have made a commitment to helping people get connected to those resources. And so I'm happy to continue this conversation and/or help people find access to whatever it is that they're looking for. And so the best way to get in touch with me is to probably email or call. I would say actually probably email, because we are transferring our phone systems over right now. I don't want to miss any. So probably just at info@borncounseling.com.
And okay, so info@borncounseling.com. And of course, a good place to start would probably be borncounseling.com, right? BORN counseling.com.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, we are switching all of the phones over. And the only reason I'm trigger shy today is because I got an email that said, I've been texting you and I didn't get you. And I was like, no, it's not forwarding. So I'm triaging that right now. So let's stick with the info@Born Counseling, or just go to borncounseling.com. Yeah.
All right, perfect. And then is there a specialty that you work with in your practice? Is there somebody who would not be ideal or maybe a good fit for your particular skill set? I mean,
We've got clinicians that work with a wide variety of issues. So we've got a clinician who specializes in working with kids and teens, and we've got a clinician who focuses primarily on trauma and doing EMDR intensives. We have a clinician who does somatic experiencing. We really have the ability to target a wide range of issues.
mhm.
And so I don't know that there is anybody that's necessarily inappropriate to call. And if you're not a good fit for us, then we'll connect you to somebody that you would be a good fit for. So.
And if someone's listening to this outside of the area and they want to reach out to you, can you work with somebody who doesn't live in Arizona?
So I personally can work with people in Arizona, Missouri, Texas, and Florida.
Okay.
Because of the licensing regulations. And we have networks that reach far and wide. So if you are listening from a different state and need to access services, we can help find somebody that's local in your area.
Okay.
Some referrals that way.
Wonderful. Well, Jamie, it's been a true pleasure. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thanks for having me.